Hi friends, I'm Brea and welcome to my channel, Tales of Tales. So today we're going to be doing my quarterly wrap up. And if you're new here, the reason I do quarterly wrap ups is because sometimes I don't read enough in a given month to warrant a monthly wrap up. So quarterly is just the way that we're doing it around here. And if you watched my last quarterly wrap up, I tried this format where I kind of filmed in different locations just so that I don't get bored filming, standing in one spot for 30 minutes, and you don't get bored watching me stand in one spot for 30 minutes. So we're gonna do the same type of format in this video, so you'll kind of see me change locations throughout this video. So let's go ahead and get into the books that I read for October, November, and December. So first up, we have The Wind at My Back by Misty Copeland, which I read on audio. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Misty Copeland kind of came to fame as the first African-American principal ballerina at the American Ballet Theater in 2015. Misty has her own separate memoir, but this memoir specifically focuses on her relationship with her mentor, Raven Wilkerson, who was kind of a trailblazer in the industry as she tried to become kind of a notable Black ballerina in the 1950s and 60s. And so Misty really talks about how she felt alone until she met Raven. She talks about some of her and Raven's moments, as well as, you know, kind of walking us through Raven's history and some of the experiences that they shared. And I think this memoir does a really good job of giving us insight into what it takes to be the first Black anything, you know, the struggles that go with it and the work that goes into that. And I think sometimes, you know, when there's like a first Black whatever, the only person that kind of gets notoriety is that person. We don't really talk about the people that came before them that helped break some of those boundaries and made it easier for that person to get there. And so I think this memoir does a really good job of highlighting that and highlighting Raven's history and how it helped Misty get to where she is today. And you know, this book also touched on colorism, which I really appreciated, because if you haven't seen Misty Copeland, she is a fair-skinned Black person. So I appreciated that they talked about colorism and the fact that both her and Raven, you know, they did experience some privilege because of their skin tones, and that a darker skinned Black person maybe would have had some additional obstacles to overcome in this industry. And so I really appreciated that that was mentioned in this book as well. And so like I mentioned, I listened to this on audio and it was a pretty quick listen, and it was still interesting to me even though I really had no interest in ballet prior to reading this book. So even if you don't have like a background in ballet, or you don't necessarily find interest in it, I would still recommend it because I think you would still get a lot out of it. And I would just like to say that it's really mind-blowing and crazy to me that in 2015 we're still experiencing first Black anything. It's 2023 and I'm sure this year there's gonna be the first Black person to do something. She just blows my mind. So up next I have a short horror novella called The Murders of Molly Southbourne by Today Thompson. And so in this novella we follow a girl named Molly, and she lives by one rule, and that rule is don't bleed. And she doesn't want to bleed because every time she does, an identical version of herself appears, but that version of herself always tries to kill the original. So there's always a bunch of Mollys running around trying to end her life. And so it kind of poses the question, why is this happening, and is there a way to stop it? So I gave this book 4 stars because it definitely kept me invested in figuring out if everyone was going to survive all these Mollys running around and trying to figure out what was actually happening to this girl. And I didn't give this book 5 stars because there was something a little off and something missing in regards to the parental relationships that were depicted in this book. But this book was definitely effective, being as short as it was, and I think it could definitely be a full-length novel. So if you're looking for something short in the horror genre, I would definitely recommend this one. So up next is The Women Could Fly by Megan Giddings, and I also listened to this on audio. And this is a dystopian novel where witches are real and women are closely monitored to determine if they are actually a witch. So kind of think about like modern day Salem witch trials. So in this world, we're following this 28-year-old woman named Josephine, and Josephine is trying to figure out what happened to her mother, who just kind of up and disappeared a few years ago. No one knows what actually happened to her, but there are a few theories and some speculation out there. The biggest theory kind of revolving around her mother being a witch. So when her mother's will is kind kind of finally read off. Something is left for Josephine that might actually help her find her mother. So we follow Josephine as she's trying to go on this quest to find her mom. And you know, I was excited and nervous to get into this book because I previously read Lakewood by Megan Giddings, and Lakewood I loved the idea of the book, but I didn't like the execution. So I was afraid that that was going to happen going into this book, and unfortunately it kind of did lean that way for this as well. You know, I just don't think I vibe with Megan Giddings' writing style that much. I felt like the pacing of this book was a little off. I felt like we focused too much on like the beginning background of the story when I feel like it really could have been condensed. And I feel like there's like an element of emotion that I was just kind of lacking. I didn't really feel invested in the character or her mom for that matter. And the relationships in her life just kind of felt like lackluster a little bit to me. So, you know, I think I'm going to give Megan Giddings another go if I feel like she comes out with something that sounds interesting to me. But I feel like if I don't like the third book that I read by her, that I might just have to accept that, you know, we aren't meant to be besties. I ended up giving it like 3.25 stars because there was some obvious social commentary around like women's rights and autonomy, which I really enjoyed. And I really enjoyed like the premise of the book. Just the execution was just lacking a little bit for me there. So I would still recommend it, especially if you liked Lakewood by Megan Giddings or the premise sounds interesting to you. Definitely still pick it up. So up next for October, I read Beyond the Wand by Tom Felton. And anytime that I read an autobiography, I do try to listen to the audiobook because I just feel like, you know, me and that person are just like on FaceTime and we're having a conversation about their life. And this book kind of just focuses on Tom's life kind of leading up to being cast for Harry Potter, his experiences on and off set, and how he's navigated life post Harry Potter. And this was a really interesting perspective on how some of these kids were kind of like skyrocketed to fame at such an early age and very quickly. But Tom acknowledges that his experience was obviously a little different than the main 3 stars of the movie. He talks about his family, obviously some of the behind the scenes of making the movies. But I think one of the biggest topics that he kind of talks about and that ties everything together is his battle with addiction. You know, and I actually had no idea that Tom went to rehab and that he had issues with addiction. So hearing it from his perspective was just really eye-opening for me. And I think Tom did a really good job of interjecting humor while also giving fans of the movie or fans of the books, you know, a little bit of behind the scenes, while also just being very vulnerable with us, which I just really wasn't expecting, but was pleasantly surprised. And so I usually don't rate memoirs, so no rating here, but this book was really well done. And so with that, let's move on into November. All right, so now let's talk about the books that I read for November, and let me know how you feel about this filming location because I'm not sure. All right, I'm just trying something new. We're trying something new together. So first up for November, we have Adulthood Rites by Octavia E. Butler. And this is the second book in the Lilith's Brood trilogy. So in this series, humans have some nuclear war and are on the brink of extinction, of course. And so some aliens pluck a few survivors off of Earth to help save the human race. And these aliens have their own idea of what the future of humanity should look like. And so they end up awakening this woman named Lilith, who was one of the survivors that they picked up from Earth. And she is tasked to help carry out the plan that these aliens have. And so in this second book, we're introduced to a new character and a new POV, but this POV is pivotal in this series. And so this character is kind of tasked to bridge the gap in between aliens and the human race. And while I didn't enjoy this as much as Dawn, I still feel like this has solidified Octavia Butler's spot in my heart as one of my favorite authors ever. I think she does a really good job of being able to tell a complex story in a really accessible way, especially compared to some other like heavy sci-fi writers. And, you know, and I don't know how she does it. Her stories and concepts and ideas are always just really timeless. You know, this was published in 1988, but it's still relevant in 2022, 2023. And, you know, she she's just really able to tell a compelling story and just really nail the nuance of humanity and all of like the little ins and outs that kind of just make being a human complicated. And so I'm giving Adulthood Rites 3.75, and I would definitely be finishing the rest of this series in 2023. So the next 3 books that I'm going to talk about were a part of a vlog I did where I read 3 of my 5-star predictions. So if you want any more in-depth thoughts on the next 3 books I'm going to talk about, make sure you go and watch this video. But first up, we are going to talk about All of Us Villains by Amanda Foody and Christina Lynn Herman. So this is a YA dystopian novel, which is essentially the Hunger Games but with magic. So in the setting of the story, we have common magic, which everybody can essentially access. And then we have high magic, which is definitely more rare and definitely more powerful. So every 20 years, these 7 prestigious families name a champion. And these champions are always children. And the champions are tasked to fight to the death until there's 1 kid standing, and the winner of the tournament ends up winning control of all the high magic for their family until the next tournament. And so this story is multi-POV, which I wasn't expecting, but I really did enjoy because we really get into the characters' heads and we kind of get their mindset before the tournament. We get to find out what their families are like and what's really motivating them to win other than not dying. And you know, I think for a YA dystopian, I think the development of the characters was really well done. You know, you feel like you're kind of there with the characters as they evolve and their motivations actually start to change throughout the tournament. But I ended up giving this a 3.5, mostly because the ending just felt really abrupt to me. It didn't feel like it had any real resolution, and I understand why that was done because there is a sequel to this book, and so obviously the authors want you to pick up the sequel, but I just feel like there should have been a few more questions answered before the book ended. But if you're looking for a YA dystopian novel, I say give this one a go. It did grab my attention. It kept me flipping the pages. And so it was an enjoyable read for me. However, I don't think I'm going to continue on in the series just because at this point in my life, for me to finish and go on with the series, I just like really have to be invested. And that just isn't this for me this time. So up next we have We Ride Upon Sticks by Quan Berry, and this follows like a high school field hockey team and them finding these like magical powers through this like weird poster. It's like really hard to explain, but these magical powers make them better at field hockey, but it also gives them this like collective like group think. So it makes them better as a team because they're all in sync, but it also just gives them insight into what's happening in each other's lives occasionally. And I don't know what I was expecting going into this book, but it wasn't what it actually was. So I think I was going into this book expecting a little bit more like magic, and this really to me falls more into like a coming of age story, which I still did enjoy. I think just because I wasn't in the right mindset, I didn't enjoy it as much as maybe somebody else would. But if you like 80s vibes, which I do as well, this book definitely gives just like quintessential 80s vibes. It gives like cute 80s movie, and I would love to actually see this in movie form if they could figure out how to do like the group think aspect of it. And so the last book I read for November and the last book that I read in that 5-star predictions video was The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. So this follows a group of native characters who ended up shooting some elk about 10 years ago, and because they didn't follow tradition, these elk end up stalking them later in life in a very weird and spooky way. Surprisingly, this book is actually multi-POV, which I was not expecting, because we're following about one POV about halfway through the book, and we try to understand why the character feels like they're being haunted by this elk and the role they played in the day that they ended up going on this hunting trip. And so this book was a lot darker than I thought it was going to be. It was a lot more gory and a lot more vivid than I thought it was going to be, but I absolutely loved it. So Stephen Graham Jones has this really magical way of writing people's like internal thoughts and monologues, and you're really able to put yourself in the character's shoes. Like you think that you are the character almost, and just like how you almost feel a little crazy when you read some of his characters, but the way that it's done is just like nothing I've ever read before. And with this book in particular, the ending was phenomenal. I am someone who really enjoys just like an ending that kind of tells a story past just the surface level, and I wasn't expecting that necessarily with this, but I got it and I absolutely loved it. So spoiler alert for my other video, I did actually give one book 5 stars, and I absolutely love this, and I just love Stephen Graham Jones, and he is slowly becoming one of my favorite authors. All right, and now let's move into December, where I read a bunch of books. Okay, not only are we transitioning down, the sun is also going down, so let's wrap this up. So first book I read in December was Jackal by Aaron E. Adams, and this follows this town where a lot of Black young girls always go missing around the same time almost every year, and we are specifically following this woman named Liz, and Liz is coming home for her best friend's wedding, and this wedding is held at this plantation, and we really get thrown into the story once Liz's friend's daughter, who is mixed, ends up going missing. So obviously there's this search for this little girl, but Liz is also thrown back in time when she was in school and one of the other Black girls went missing. And keep in mind, this town is mostly white. There are very few Black people that live in this town, so there's definitely like this racist like undertone. And so not only are we following current day, past day, we are also learning about all of the other girls that have gone missing and their background. I was really enjoying this book. Like, the pages were flipping. I was eating this up. Like, the writing and the pacing like just really grabbed me, and I was flying through this book. Okay, and then we hit the end, and if you've seen any other reviews for this book, I think a lot of people talk about how they are really disappointed in the ending. And I don't know if I would say disappointing for me is the right word. I was just a little surprised, but not in a good way. I feel like there's a bit added to the ending that wasn't needed. Like, the book could have stayed exactly the same, and something could have been taken out or not as been as prominent, and I think the book would have been more successful for a lot of people. And I think going into it, a lot of people weren't expecting this small like supernatural element to be involved in this book, which it was. And I'm usually all for a supernatural element, but it just didn't feel right in this book, in my opinion. If the ending would have been a little different, this would have easily been like a 4.5, 5 star for me. But because the ending threw me off so much, I have to give it like a 3.75, but I would definitely read from Aaron E. Adams again, and I think it was well done. Just ending, just, it wasn't it. It wasn't it. And then the next few books I'm going to talk about were books that I read as part of this vlog, because let me tell you, I was scrambling at the end of the year to try to hit my Goodreads goal, which I did. So I read a bunch of short books at the end of December, so definitely go watch that if you are just interested in me being frantic. But the first book I read for that vlog was The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nevo. And this is a fantasy novella where we follow a character who is trying to weave together and fill in some missing parts of history when it comes to the rise of this empress called Inyo. And these missing parts are being filled in by this character named Rabbit, who is verbally telling our other main character about Inyo, as Rabbit was Inyo's handmaiden. And you know, surprisingly, with the length of this story, you really get emotionally invested in multiple characters, not just one. And you know, this really could be a full-length novel and I would eat it up. So I'm really excited to see where the rest of this series goes. I feel like the way that this ended, we could be following a lot of different storylines, and it could be telling a lot of different characters' POV. I think we're left with enough information to know where we're gonna go. So I ended up giving this a 3.75, and I'm really interested in continuing on with the series. So this next book was a doozy. And that was The Least of My Scars by Stephen Graham Jones. So this is a short horror book that follows this serial killer. And you know, he's not like your everyday serial killer. He actually is like fed people to kill instead of having to go out and hunt them. However, we follow him as his normal routine is kind of interrupted after we follow like the first kill that kind of opens up the book. We are inside his very sick mind as he tries to deal with that disruption. We also get to learn about like his past and a little bit how like he ended up in this situation to begin with. This book is horrifying in a lot of ways because we are really in the mind of this like really psychotic person, and obviously he's a serial killer, but like it's like in vivid detail about the type of things that he likes to do to people, and just like kind of some of the games that he plays with people while he's murdering them. And you know, these are really vivid descriptions. Almost nothing is really left to the imagination. Nothing is really fade to black when it comes to like the horror scenes. It's there. So if you are queasy at all, if you are sensitive to multiple different trigger warnings, then I would take this book with caution, okay? Surprisingly, even though this was a really twisted book, I ended up giving it 4 stars just because the way that this ended was something that I was not expecting. The last 2 pages really kind of, for me, made it worth reading through everything else. Like, it really is a twist that just kind of has you reeling. It really just gets your mind going. And even though I gave it 4 stars, I never want to read anything like this ever again. I was debating between giving it a 1 star and a 4 star. I ended up with 4 star, but don't get it twisted. We'll never be reading anything like this ever again. And so the next book I read, I actually listened to on audio, and that was Even Though I Knew the End by C.L. Polk. So this is a sapphic fantasy novella set in the 1930s that follows this magical detective who 10 years ago, she sold her soul to the devil. And we are following her present day as she is made an offer to save her soul. But to do this, she has to find out who is this notorious serial killer called the White City Vampire. But this author did a really good job of like really just immersing you in the story right away. You know, we get to know a little bit about the character, how they're in the predicament that they're in. You know, we also quickly get to know who is making this offer to our main character. And so I think the author did a really good job of doing that in such a short amount of time. However, I think I was expecting a little bit more when it came to the romance. I feel like because certain scenarios were happening in the book and because of a certain situation that was happening in the book, we didn't really get to know that much of the love interest. And for me, I wasn't as invested in the love story. And so that really hindered my enjoyment, I think, of not only the whole story, but definitely the ending. So I ended up giving this 3 stars. I would definitely read from this author again, but this book just fell a little short for me when it came to like the whole story that it was trying to tell. Then we have A House at the Bottom of the Lake by Josh Malerman. So I did read this physically. However, I checked it out from the library and I no longer have a copy. But this follows 2 teenagers who decide for their first date they are going to go out on a lake. And while they are canoeing, they end up stumbling upon A House at the Bottom of a Lake. And this book really grips you into telling a story about like the unknown. And while we are following these characters exploring this house at the bottom of the lake, you're never really sure if something creepy is going to happen or not. And I feel like Josh Malerman did a really good job of, you know, kind of keeping you on your toes and, you know, making this sense of like eeriness throughout the book that I feel like was really well done, and it was really special in the way that he did it, because I feel like he was able to do it quickly and he was able to do it in a really like accessible way. However, I'll say that the ending for me, I think it's gonna be hit or miss for people, right? I think the ending makes sense for this book, but it wasn't like my favorite necessarily, and so I'm gonna keep it short and brief there because it is a short book. But I say definitely give it a go if you're looking for something that's going to be kind of quick, but it's going to be something that really keeps your attention. I definitely recommend this book, and I ended up giving it 4 stars. And then the next book is Before the Coffee Gets Cold, which I also listened to on audio because I was trying to move it. I was booking it at the end of the year, okay? So Before the Coffee Gets Cold follows this coffee shop where people are able to time travel. They're able to go back in time to have conversations with someone from their past, you know, whether that's like a loved one or a brother or sister. They're able to travel back in time to have this conversation. However, there are rules that people have to follow to be able to travel back in time. And because of these rules, a lot of people don't actually take this opportunity. So we follow multiple stories of people who want to travel back in time for various reasons. And I think every single like storyline in this, I think will do something different for every person who reads it. You know, this book definitely like pulls at your heartstrings a little bit. It didn't necessarily like make you cry, but it definitely makes you think a little bit more about how we view present conversations and maybe what we would do to go back in time and redo a conversation or just to find out more information. And so I definitely recommend this book if you're just looking for something that's a little heartfelt, you know, and something that maybe just touches you a little bit here. And so I ended up giving it a 4.25 stars. And then we have Piranesi by Susanna Clark, and this book is really hard to explain, and I feel like it's almost best if you go into it not knowing too much. But we are following this man who is living in this house that is kind of built like a world, and we are trying to figure out why he's there, how he got there, and just some of the mysteries of the house. It is such a magical book, and it's really hard to put in words why it's so magical. But listen, just read it. I'm just gonna leave it there because I think if you know anything else about the book, then I think it's gonna take away from your experience of reading it. But I gave this book 5 stars. And I know I just did not give you guys a lot to work off there, but just pick it up. Okay, just read it. And then after I finished that vlog, I still hadn't reached my Goodreads goal. I was still 3 books off. So the last 3 books I read at the end of the year, the first one was Behind Her Eyes by Sarah Pinborough. So this book had been running the gamut on BookTube for a very long time, and I know there also is a Netflix like short series on this, and this is about a woman who ends up meeting this man at a bar. She ends up really liking him until she finds out that he's married, and she finds out that it's actually her boss. And so then in a mysterious way, she ends up also becoming friends with his wife, but she's keeping it a secret from both people that like she knows each of them. You know, at the surface, both this husband and the wife that our main character is getting to know, their marriage at the surface seems almost perfect. They're a beautiful couple, but as she gets to know both of them, she realizes that's not the case, and she realizes that something's a little off here. That there are some things that might have happened in their past that she's trying to piece together and figure out what's up with this couple for real. And you know, I really thought I had a sense of what this ending was going to be, and when I tell you there's no way that I could have predicted what this ending was, but it was so good. Like, I know everybody always talks about the ending of this book, but it really did it for me, and I ended up giving this book 5 stars. So it was really a good way to like help try to round out the end of my 2022 reading year. And then I read Amari and the Night Brothers by B.B. Alston, which is a middle grade fantasy novel about Amari, and Amari's brother went missing and nobody knows what really happened to him until she stumbles upon this magical briefcase, and this briefcase is a clue into this world that might help her find out what actually happened to her brother. And so we are immersed in this like new magical world, and we're following along as Amari is not only trying to prove herself in this new world, but also figure out what happened to her brother. And this book, you guys, just really warmed my heart. Like, I got that sense of like childlike joy reading this book. You know, when you were younger and you read a book that just like made you want to keep turning the chapters, and it really sparked your sense of wonder and magic. And this book is just really special. And I know I'm not the first person to talk about this and give it glowing reviews. I just really love this, and I gave it 5 stars, obviously. And so I'm definitely going to be picking up the next book in this, which I think is already out. And it's called Amari and the Great Game. And yeah, this is great. And the last book I read for 2022 was The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin. So this book is about a man who, when he dreams, his dreams become reality. And so obviously that's not doing well for his mental. So he ends up going to this doctor, but the doctor quickly figures out how to manipulate those dreams for his own gain. And so we follow our main character as he's trying to learn how to control his dreams, as well as he's trying to navigate these multiple new realities, and as he's trying to stop his doctor from controlling his dreams. So in my 7 books in 7 days vlog, I actually picked this up, but I ended up putting it down about 50 pages of the way in. And I think part of that is because there was a lot of like science heavy language in here, because we're talking a lot about like the brain and how memory works and how sleep works. We are kind of getting like the scientific background interwoven into some of the dialogue, and that just like didn't really work for me. And I found myself like trying to like skim over those parts, but because it was interwoven into other dialogue, it was like important for me to like read that. So I ended up putting it down. But when I picked it back up, I think I was a little bit more prepared for what I was getting into. And so I was able to kind of get in the flow of the book. And while on paper, I feel like I should have really loved this book just based on the concepts of like dreams and memory, which is one thing I already love. And then 2, I also love the idea of like alternate realities and like what those could look like. And that's also covered in this. I really should have loved this, but there was like a disconnect with how this was written. Like I felt like there was a disconnect between me and the characters. There was no like emotion involved almost. And so I ended up giving this 3 stars, and it's really unfortunate because I've heard a lot of good things about Ursula K. Le Guin, and I think I will still pick something up by her. This book was just a miss for me, and some other people I've talked to that have tried to read this also said they put it down at one point, but this book is definitely for someone. It just wasn't for me, and like I said, on paper it should have worked, but it just didn't. All right, so that wraps up my quarterly wrap up. You know, I read a lot of things in October, November, and December. Some things that were okay and some things that were really great. And so the next video you guys are going to be seeing is my top 10 of 2022. Some of which were actually included in this video, so make sure you keep an eye out for that. And let me know down below in the comments how your end of the year reading was and what you're looking forward to reading in 2023. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.